There are two kinds of lies that leaders tell. Lies that they tell to other governments or to other leaders. And then there are the lies that they tell to their own people. Leaders understand that sometimes they have to lie to each other. And that's an acceptable form of lying in most cases. In fact, publics don't punish leaders when they lie to other leaders. But when you lie to your own people, you're really committing a sin in the eyes of most people. And most leaders recoil at the idea that they might be accused of lying to their own publics, although they sometimes do that. The Bush administration, to include President Bush himself, told 4 major lies about the Iraq War. I'm certain that Kerry understood that they told lies. Tell a lie means that you know that what you are saying is false. I think that Donald Trump, during his presidency, made many thousands of false statements. I think they were not lies because he actually believed what he was saying. He would say things that everybody, virtually everybody, knew were not true. And they would accuse him of lying. But again, Trump actually believed what he said. Bush did not lie much. And therefore, his lies, when he told them, were very effective because people expected him to tell the truth. And therefore, it was easy for President Bush to fool the American people because he was not someone who lied all the time. Anytime President Trump said X, people would go check whether X was true or not. So his lies had very little effect. In Bush's case, his lies were strategic lies. They were used, and I'm talking more about the Bush administration than the president himself, although he participated, but it included Rumsfeld, Colin Powell, and so forth and so on. They said things that simply were not true. And this did help us get us into the Iraq War. And in fact, what was going on here is that the Bush administration was having a very difficult time selling the war to the American people. And the only way they could sell the war and get us involved was tell a handful of lies about Iraqi weapons of mass destruction, about the relationship between Osama bin Laden and Saddam Hussein, and then convince the American people that we should actually fight this unnecessary war. And of course, what happened was they succeeded in making the case to the American people that a war was justified, but it was based in good part on a series of lies. Lying sometimes makes good sense. I mean, it was one of the main points that I tried to make in the book. If we look at what President George Bush and his administration did in the run-up to the Iraq War, obviously that backfired, that did consequences. I could point out to you a number of cases where leaders have lied and it's worked to their advantage. And I think the best case is John F. Kennedy's lies during the Cuban Missile Crisis was evolving. The Soviets were going to take their missiles out of Cuba. Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet leader, told John F. Kennedy, the Americans had to take the Jupiter missiles, but the problem was that if it became public knowledge. So what Kennedy told Khrushchev was, listen, I'm going to take the Jupiters out of Turkey. We have a deal, but you have to understand that I'm going to have to deny that I'm taking the Jupiter missiles out of Turkey. I'm in effect going to have to lie to the American people and to my allies. So when you hear me saying I'm not taking the Jupiter missiles out, you should understand that I am taking the Jupiter missiles out. Anyway, Kennedy was willing to lie to the American people and to our European allies. And he did it for good strategic reasons. This was not a selfish lie. Kennedy was not doing this for self-serving purposes. He was doing it for the good of the country. And actually, one could argue the good of the world, because we, in the end, avoided a war. The reason leaders don't lie that much to each other is that leaders don't trust other leaders to begin with. That makes it easier for leaders to lie to their own people than to lie to other leaders. During the run-up to the Iraq War in 2003, I went to MIT to listen to a talk, and a man who knew a lot about Iraqi WMD convinced me that Iraq had no weapons of mass destruction, WMD. So I started telling people that. Then Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld said that we know that Iraq has WMD, and indeed we know where those WMD are located. Well, I believe them. I said to myself, the Secretary of Defense and the Secretary of State are not going to lie to the American people. I actually think it's much harder to tell a lie today for two reasons. One is people are much more cynical today than they were 10 or 15 years ago. The second point I would make is that with Twitter, with Wikipedia, with the internet more generally, anytime you say something, a couple thousand people go out and check what you said to see whether it's correct or not. And then if they find that you're not telling the truth, they spread that word around the planet. I distinguish between two broad categories, deception and truth-telling. Truth-telling is where if you ask me a question, I go to great lengths to tell you everything in as straightforward a way as possible about the question you're asking. That's truth-telling. Deception can take three forms. So let's say that I try to deceive you. One is I can lie to you. That is where I say something that I know is not true. Second, I can conceal something from you. It could be that I had been arrested 10 years ago and put in jail, and you're asking me a question about my past behavior, and I just conceal the fact that I was in jail. That's different than lying. If you asked me, John, were you in jail ever in your life? And I said, no, that would be a lie. But if I just don't raise the subject, I'm concealing the issue. Spinning is something that we do all the time in our daily life. Spinning is where we don't tell a lie, but we construct the story in a way that is the most favorable to us. If you're interviewing me for a job and I come to your office and you ask me all sorts of questions about my past experiences, I'm going to spin the stories about my life in the most positive way. I'm going to arrange the facts in a way that will make me look good to you so that you will hire me. But it is, if you think about it, a form of deception. When you talk about nationalism, whether you're talking about Indian nationalism, American nationalism, almost everybody who writes about nationalism knows that nationalism is based on myths. Indians and Americans, Israelis, Egyptians, you name it, all these peoples tell themselves stories about their past that are not true. They're myths, but they fervently believe those myths. And therefore, when they repeat the myths, one is tempted to say they're lying, but they're really not lying because they believe what they say. This is why professional historians in the academic world are so dangerous for countries, because historians are interested in telling the truth. Historians are interested in undermining myths, but nationalism requires myths, and nationalism is the most powerful political ideology on the planet. And although at first glance it looks like nationalism is all about lies, it really isn't in a technical sense, because people believe those myths. One would think that today the United States would be focusing on China as the great threat, and it would be working to repair its relations with Russia so that Russia and the United States would be allied against China. if you think about the period before World War II, the United States and the Soviet Union were at first adversaries. But once the Soviet Union went to war against Nazi Germany, the United States and the Soviet Union became allies against Nazi Germany. It was imperative for the United States to have the Soviet Union as an ally against Nazi Germany. Well, today, given what a powerful country China is and what a serious threat it represents to the United States, you would expect the United States to be allied with Russia against China. But that's not the case. And in many quarters in the United States, Russia is seen as a greater threat than China. And this, in good part, revolves around the belief that the Russians interfered in the 2016 election and they're responsible for Hillary Clinton's defeat. I believe that there is hardly any evidence to support that. I believe that it's based on myths. The truth is that Hillary Clinton and her supporters do believe that the Russians are responsible for her defeat, even though that's not true. So you cannot accuse them of lying. What's going on here is you have delusional thinking. The Russophobia in the United States is delusional. And we therefore are in this bizarre situation where we're paying all this attention to Russia, which is not a very powerful state, is a declining great power. And at the same time, that's preventing us from working with the Russians to contain the Chinese. And the Chinese, or China, is a serious threat, not just to the United States, but to India as well. Well, someone like Julian Assange makes it much more difficult for leaders to conceal what they're doing and to lie. You want to remember, I said there were three forms of deception: spinning, concealment, and lying. And concealment, although we're not focusing on that in our discussion, we're talking about lying. Concealment is very important. Snowden was revealing secrets that the United States wanted to keep secret. And so these guys are real threats. And of course, the state, the US government has gone to great lengths to silence them and to punish them for deterrent purposes. Well, I think there's a widespread belief that in a democracy, it's important that over time, the private papers, the official papers of governments and leaders be made available to the broader public and especially to historians and scholars, because it's important that we know what happened in the past so we can figure out how to understand our history, number one, and also we can operate more effectively in the present and in the future because we understand what happened in the past. So there's this widespread belief that ultimately you want to get all the facts out and then let people make sense of the facts. And the United States has been very effective in that regard, and I think it's all for the good.